Okay, so my talk is entitled Living in Parallel, Adventures in Pluralism and Double Consciousness. So the lecture summary, I'm going to talk about the origins and the definitions of the term, because it's quite an old one, double consciousness, and the background in terms of the reasons for this research and why I believe it's relevant today. Then I'm going to go into some examples and application areas, and some of the counter arguments, which I think are important in any research. And then I'm going to look at some of the quantifiable benefits and the conclusions. So the original term was from Du Bois in 1897, and he was using it to describe the internal conflict experienced by subordinate groups in an oppressive society, i.e. African Americans can experience a double consciousness from being an American and an African American at the same time. Huxley then used, or alluded to at least, the term in '62 when he talked about having to be oneself and completely something else at the same time, being the whole secret of life, and that we should take regular holidays from the self. And then Roy Ascott, much more recently, he talked about double consciousness explicitly in the sense of the state of being which gives access at one and the same time to two distinctly different fields of experience. And he refers to the shamanic trance in which the shaman is both in the everyday world and at the same time navigating the outermost limits of other worlds, which is arguably now mirrored by our ability to move through the infinities of cyberspace whilst within the structures of the material world. So, for instance, in virtual reality, we're both in the virtual space and in the physical space at the same time, and very viscerally, and very, in a very embodied way. This techno-shamanism may lead to an evolution of cognition where the subject-object relationship is dissolved and reality begins to be actively constructed rather than passively observed. So in terms of the reasons why I'm interested in this concept of double consciousness, I think that we're seeing much more often we're seeing trends of attempts to live elsewhere. If we look at the hikikomori, 500,000 Japanese that are deciding to sort of log out of society and live in a gaming environment, we're seeing that 90% of our time is spent indoors primarily. Even generally, a lot of children are spending more time indoors than ever before, and actually they spend less time outside than prison inmates. And obviously now with lockdown, we're relishing being outside. But I think the constant zooming, the constant screen interaction is decontextualizing us. We're losing what's called optical flow because we're not moving around in the world. And what's the loss of movement? It seems to be, creativity and cognition, because we're stagnant, we're sitting down, we're also being decolonized by these technologies. And we're all facing the death shadow. The ultimate sort of double consciousness is life and death. And the ancient mystery schools of Greece and Rome and the Egyptian mystery schools were all about learning about this initiation into death and dying consciously. And I think there's this thing where you're going through this initiation of rebirth, resurrection, and you enter this liminal space and you come back transformed. So there's a long history of this idea of understanding that we have this ability to be in two places at once. And then we're having this idea of paradox management, where for instance, a dead tree is an ecosystem for new life. So it's this idea of trying to hold multiple different perspectives at the same time. We're in a self-terminating system at the moment, and we can all see what capitalism is doing to the planet. But it's also the best time to be alive in lots of regards. So how can these things be true at the same time? Trying to feature all of these different perspectives without collapsing to one or the other is what this double consciousness is all about. We've created a deeply fragile situation, but now we need to come up with solutions. And I think that's why this stuff's so interesting. So one example of a double consciousness is an optical illusion. This is a key attribute to double consciousness. So common to all of these historical examples is having the ability to expand the perceptual field to give access at one and the same time to two distinctly different fields of experience. And if you think about watching an optical illusion, there's a moment of pleasure when the second perspective comes into focus. It's almost like a little flash of enlightenment as our awareness broadens, like suddenly seeing out of a part of our eyes which we didn't have access to before. Experiences such as these are like medicine for our consciousness, broadening our perceptual bandwidth and leaving us with an awareness that we are agents in constructing our reality. And this was a quote from Kevin, who's inspired by some of the posts I make on Facebook, such as these. So I'm trying to create a visual grammar of these ideas, this being a cloud tree, this being what looks like concrete, but is actually New Delhi from above. This is a tree man. This is the ear in the forest. This is actually a baby weasel riding a woodpecker. It looks like it's fun and games, but actually the weasel is attacking the woodpecker. And this sort of tongue-in-cheek idea. So it's all about creating, for me, visual grammars on something like social media. Like I use Facebook. I'm trying to invert Facebook, so I'm using it to create movements, and people end up sending me examples of this sort of stuff. So this is just a man with no arms and a man with no legs riding a bicycle. So you need both parts of the equation for that to be possible. And the ones I mentioned about the death literacy, this sort of idea, this one, another sort of, this one's actually an artist piece, hermit crab using a human skull as a shell. And then a very serious one, this for me is absolute double consciousness. A mother is listening to a dead son's heartbeat inside a 4-year-old transplant. So again, both sides of the equation in full, benefit. So living in virtual reality is definitely what Roy Ascott's alluding to. And I think that it's true. Like this was some really interesting work where you're really in a performative space when you're in a virtual environment. And they're looking at this idea of you're in a game, but then if you design the game to also understand that you have an inside and an outside to the experience, that's why they're making the Oculus look a lot more interesting. And then we've got Mark Farid up here, who's wearing somebody else in his Seeing Eye project, where he wants to wear somebody else for a month and look through somebody else's eyes and hear through their ears, and won't have access to his own hearing or his own seeing, in order to try and to see if he can dissolve his own personality and adopt somebody else's. Again, more problematic because he's obviously still in his own body, but is he benefiting from such a thing, or is it just a one-way interaction? And this, again, very controversial, virtual reality being used to ease the pain of childbirth. Isn't it disassociation from a very natural process? Again, it's not used during childbirth, but just for proceeding. So the counter-argument to this example, living in virtual reality, I worry for the man losing his senses. Inhabiting the perspective of another is more often aligned with escapism than a constructivist activity. And then if we think about shows like Westworld, they make an artificial world where you can go and explore your darkest desires, which would be illegal in real life. Again, it's highly dubious because it's a problematic narrative. But one of the main arguments for these virtual environments is that you get it out of your system, that you get the inner violence out of your system, because none of these things in the virtual space are real. And then maybe you won't be violent in real life. But it's a big maybe, because you're still building neural networks whilst inside the virtual, and it's absolutely possible to create trauma virtually. So the second example is a project that I'm involved with in Imperial College London, DMT extended. So the previous study of which I'm featured there, I'm having my EEG, so brain scan as in an fMRI scanner, whilst being injected with DMT. I haven't got time to go into what DMT is, but it's something that's core to your natural state. So it's present in the womb when you're being manufactured by your mother, and it's there at death. So it's a very key part and very natural part of our systems. But the DMT extended experiment is to effectively see if we can prolong the experience so that we can study it more effectively. So this is me before the DMT infusion, and this is me after. And then what I'm very interested in is when I actually on this particular substance, I'm able to see this language, this hieroglyphic language, which looks like VR at the core of my vision. And so I'm explaining here to a group on Facebook, do you also see this language? And people started sending me examples of what they see on DMT. This was the closest one from Alison Gray, but still not quite there. But it is very interesting that it seems digital. It seems like VR. But again, the counter argument to this experiment, there is a danger that the psychedelic state is being overly romanticized, and I think that's absolutely true, and we're seeing that across the board. But DMT extended could be argued to be a new form of biochemical VR, where our minds are getting stuck into another Game of Thrones that is not on a screen, but inside our minds. We have to rise above everything being reduced to entertainment. Otherwise, we will become junkies of altered states that just don't go anywhere. So that's from Jack Charles Locker, a good friend of mine. And then Huxley, who I mentioned earlier on in the talk, talked a lot about making the best of all worlds, but he actually dismissed a lot of the work he wrote, the stuff he wrote in Doors of Perception about the other shore, and spent the last few years of his life warning people about the dangers of escaping into a nirvana apart from the world. And this is a very interesting example of what you could argue is double consciousness, which is the Cordyceps mushroom, which infects the ant. The ant then goes on this journey as a zombie ant, and basically climbs up a certain time. It climbs up a certain to a certain height and goes on to a certain angle of a leaf, then chomps down on the leaf. At that point, the mushroom comes up through its body and then spreads its spores and infects all the ants beneath. So not really a double consciousness, because the ant is, it's co-opted, but it's not really benefiting from this double consciousness. Whereas you could argue that a lot of the work done, again, at Imperial and other really interesting institutions, looking at psilocybin, so magic mushrooms, as a way of curing things like depression. So that's more of a double consciousness, because what we've done is we've already identified 200 different psilocybin-containing mushrooms. We've worked out how to cultivate them. We've worked out how they affect our neurochemistry, and we're spreading them around the world. So we're in the service of them, and in turn, they're transforming our consciousness and making us behold the world in a more mushroomy way. And this is from this work from Andy Letcher on a podcast recently. So the fourth example is journaling. So, for instance, I've written a diary for 30 years, and I've written it from 3 levels. So what I did is the content, what I felt is the context, the mood, and what I thought. So key ideation is the concept. So I've written those in 3 different locations, and I've got this entirely rich archive. And it provides the ability for me to be in 2 places at the same time. I can jump out of local point of view, and I can be in the overview, and I can review a month that I'm in. I can also take cross sections through my life and see 30 different me's starting to communicate again. So I'm creating the overview effect. And I absolutely see benefits from being within that compression for pure therapy, for understanding where patterns emerge that I can't see when I'm just in the local point of view. So it forces me to live, to get new material. It provides a really interesting way of sourcing wisdom. Wisdom, we know, is gained from taking a higher order perspective on your perspective. You can find wisdom in your own life by mining your own experience, which is exactly what I'm doing. So it allows me to relive past experiences, but from an alternative perspective, from the person that I am now. But only if I'm being honest with myself, both then and now. So what I'm planning to do is feed all of this into an AI, and using natural language processing, and then create an AI of myself. Again, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but that is potentially what I could do with this data. And you can see this in things like on Facebook on this day, where it takes cross sections, and you can see what you did over 10 years on this day. So it's a very interesting interface. So moving on to the quantifiable benefits of this stuff. So conscious state shifting, from Heather Hargreaves here, recognition of what state you are in and the ability to observe versus blend with states. Second point, the ability to surrender to challenging states and the ability to also shift states at will. From thinker to observer and the ability to move the observer around. So that's conscious state shifting. And then we have something called perceptual flexibility through perspective shifting. And this is interesting stuff from Nora Bateson, who says that she finds wisdom everywhere because it's in the relationships between things. So what is the feeling of that? What is the mechanism by which you can tune into the relationships between all of the different places where you might get wisdom from? So much of the time it's about noticing the pull to one thing or the other, to one story or narrative, or to one way of thinking, and resisting that pull and staying in the liminal space in between the two poles and seeing how long you can hold that space and noticing what happens in that bridge you've built. And you can see this in liminal spaces like hypnopompic states or hypnagogic states, when we're waking and going to sleep and waking up and having these amazing insights because we're in between states. Again, double consciousness. Other benefits, so there's something called relevance realization, or the salience landscape from John Vervaeke. I'm just pointing to these because it's a very short talk, and there's a full hour-long version of this one. Perceptual flexibility, again, in lucid dream states, we can practice things like Tai Chi and be more effective in our dream world. In fact, 4 times more effective, because you're having to apply the context within the lucid dream. So if you're practicing Tai Chi, you have to apply gravity, etc. So you can practice in this other space. Cognitive diversity, using VR to enter the umvelts of other species. Mel Gibson, so Marshmallow Laserfeast, done very interesting work in that, where you can look through the eyes of an insect or of a mosquito. Mel Slater, the same, brilliant work coming out of his lab, where he's putting you in the body of a drummer, and you're then in a drummer's body, a famous drummer's body, and your drumming improves because you're in this other body. And I think this is a fantastic point, again, from my friend Kevin Davidson, reimagining the imagination, encouraging the use of the imagination. I think this is fundamental to child development. We talk about Waldorf schools as schooling the imagination. It's ever more important when children are having a lot of their imagination done for them, and they have less opportunity to be bored with nothing to do, i.e. no sensory input coming at them. Watching Disney films is like toxic white sugar for the imagination. So the key in my work is we don't replace the imagination with computer animation, and we stick to declarative environments rather than prescriptive ones. So to conclude, the problem with the term double consciousness, and I'm countering myself with the argument that it implies a limit and a polarity by default, i.e. dualism. Consciousness, however, is potentially infinite. Our bodies are extremely limited, you could argue, but our minds are very much unlimited. So different umvelts demonstrate that there are as many manifestations of consciousness as there are beings, all coexisting in the universe stroke multiverse. So pluralism is where I'm taking a lot of this work, represents multiple ways of knowing, or multiple ontologies. Pluralism is unity in diversity. So it's all about dealing with otherness. And I think even more than ever, we need to be aware of that we need to hold the integral, we need to hold multiplicity, we need to be aware of this hybridity. Again, this idea of an ecology of selves. Great quote from Grant Morrison. Are we going to stick to these personalities, these bounded territorial things, or are we going to expand ourselves into something bigger? The first thing you have to change is yourself. This can be achieved through understanding your dark side. So let us become plex creatures, so we are able to take on new personality traits and able to extend our boundaries into what was previously the enemy territory. Again, this is really good practice to demonstrate to ourselves that we are co-creating our reality and ourselves. The second point, an ecology of practices. Wisdom is found by cultivating an ecology of practices such as mindfulness, embodiment, mimetic practices, having an ecology of practices. Again, this hybridity. And also from Nora Bateson, warm data, which is the idea of triple contexting or quadruple contexting, where you ask the same questions through 3 contexts or 4 contexts at the same time. And I think with all of this work, we have to understand the role of language and metaphor, how we describe states. Dimensions is a problematic term. Two places, being in two places at the same time, multiple scales at once. So I hope in this short talk I've shown you that double consciousness, when done well, does not result in building new realms of augmented escapism, but actually builds new forms of consciousness literacy. So critically, if we can increase plurality, we can also increase tolerance and awareness of each other. So thank you very much. If you want to get in touch with me, there's my email there. And also feel free to add me on Facebook, where I create a lot of these. I don't use it for personal reasons. I create these visual grammars around these ideas. So I'm going to stop sharing then. And I think we are out of time. So